Hey there. Tonight, we're traveling back not to battlefields or castles, but to something far more intimate. The quiet hours of darkness. The space between sunset and sunrise, where medieval people lived a life we've almost completely forgotten. A life where sleep didn't come in one long stretch, but in two distinct phases separated by an hour or more of gentle wakefulness. Where the night wasn't something to rush through, but something to inhabit, to use, to experience in ways that might seem strange to us now. You've been told your whole life that you need 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That waking in the middle of the night means something's wrong, that you should worry, that you should fix it. But what if that's the myth? What if those midnight hours of wakefulness aren't a problem at all, but an echo of something ancient and natural, something we've only recently lost? If this kind of slow, meandering history helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to these same quiet stories about the forgotten rhythms of the night. So dim the lights. Let the darkness settle around you. And let's begin with a question that changes everything we thought we knew about sleep. You wake at 2 in the morning. The room is dark. The house is silent. Your heart sinks because you know what this means. You're awake when you shouldn't be. You check the clock, do the math, calculate how many hours you have left before the alarm. You try to relax, but anxiety creeps in. What's wrong with you? Why can't you sleep through the night like a normal person? This scene plays out in bedrooms across the modern world every single night. Millions of people lying awake in the dark, frustrated, worried, convinced that something is broken. They call it insomnia. They take pills for it. They see specialists. They buy special mattresses and blackout curtains and white noise machines, all in pursuit of that elusive goal: 8 solid, uninterrupted hours of sleep. But here's the thing. That goal, that standard we've built our entire understanding of healthy sleep around, is relatively new. It's a modern invention, a product of electric lights and factory schedules, and a very particular moment in human history. For most of our existence as a species, humans didn't sleep this way at all. The 8-hour sleep standard became gospel sometime in the early 20th century, though its roots stretch back a bit further. It emerged from the convergence of several forces, none of them particularly concerned with what was natural or healthy for the human body. The first was industrialization. When factories began operating around the clock, when production schedules demanded workers show up at the same time every day, sleep became something that needed to be standardized, compressed, made efficient. Before factories, before time clocks and shift changes, most people's sleep was governed by the sun. You went to bed when it got dark, not because you decided 8 hours was optimal, but because there wasn't much else to do. Candles were expensive. Lamp oil cost money. Reading by firelight strained the eyes. So when the sun set, most households settled in for the night. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't stay in bed until sunrise. They slept, yes, but not in one continuous block. They slept in segments. And the time between those segments, that period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, was considered perfectly normal. It had a name. It was called the watch. The watch wasn't insomnia. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It was expected, anticipated, even valued. People used that time. They prayed. They talked with their spouses. They tended the fire. They thought about their dreams. Some got up and worked. Others stayed in bed and made love. It was a natural part of the rhythm of the night, woven into the fabric of daily life so seamlessly that people barely remarked on it. And then, gradually, it vanished. The change didn't happen overnight. It took more than a century for the old sleep pattern to fade and the new one to take its place. Artificial lighting was the first domino. When cities began installing gas lamps in the streets in the early 1800s, nighttime became less dark, less dangerous, less definitively the domain of sleep. People could stay out later. They could work later. The boundary between day and night began to blur. Then came electric light, and the transformation accelerated. Thomas Edison didn't just invent the light bulb. He fundamentally altered the human relationship with darkness. Suddenly, night was optional. You could read at midnight. You could work until 2 in the morning if you wanted. The sun no longer dictated when your day ended. Factories loved this. If workers could labor in shifts, production never had to stop. Day workers, night workers, it didn't matter as long as the machines kept running. But this created a problem. How do you coordinate hundreds or thousands of workers if everyone's sleep schedule is different? The solution was standardization. Everyone needed to sleep at roughly the same time, for roughly the same duration. 8 hours became the standard, not because it was scientifically determined to be ideal, but because it divided the day neatly into 3 parts. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours of sleep. This idea, this 3-by-8 division of the day, was championed by labor movements in the late 1800s. It was a progressive cause, a way to limit the exploitation of workers who might otherwise be forced to labor 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for what we will, 8 hours for rest. It had a nice ring to it. It seemed fair, balanced, reasonable, and it probably was in the context of industrial labor. But in making this argument and fighting for this standard, something else happened. The 8-hour sleep became more than a labor demand. It became a biological expectation. People began to believe that this was how humans were supposed to sleep. Uninterrupted, consolidated, efficient. 1 block, 8 hours, lights out to alarm clock. By the early 20th century, this new sleep pattern had become so normalized that the old way was forgotten. Books and magazines from the 1920s onward stopped mentioning first sleep and second sleep. The words themselves disappeared from common usage. Medical texts began treating nighttime wakefulness as a disorder, something to be cured rather than accepted. The natural rhythm that humans had followed for millennia was pathologized, turned into a problem that needed solving. And here we are now, generations later, lying awake at 2 in the morning, convinced we're broken, when really, we might just be remembering something our bodies never quite forgot. The story of how we rediscovered segmented sleep reads like a detective novel, complete with dusty archives, overlooked clues, and a historian who kept stumbling across the same strange phrase in documents that were centuries old. Roger Eckhart wasn't looking for it. Not at first. He was researching nighttime in pre-industrial Europe and America, trying to understand what life was like after the sun went down in an age before electric lights. He was reading through legal depositions, old court records, the kind of documents most historians skim past, looking for more dramatic material. And that's when he found it. A deposition from 1697, a case involving a woman named Jane Roth. In her testimony, she mentioned waking after her first sleep. First sleep. The phrase stopped Eckhart cold, not because it was shocking or dramatic, but because it was so casual, so unremarkable. Jane Roth mentioned it the way you might mention breakfast or afternoon, or any other ordinary part of the day. It didn't need explanation. Everyone reading that document in 1697 would have known exactly what she meant. But Eckhart didn't. He'd never heard the term before, and that made him wonder. If first sleep was a thing, was there a second sleep? And if so, what happened in between? He started looking for more references. And once he knew what to look for, they were everywhere. Hundreds of them. Thousands eventually. Scattered through diaries and letters and medical texts and prayer books and literature from across the pre-industrial Western world. References to the first sleep, to the second sleep, to waking after midnight as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Chaucer mentioned it in the Canterbury Tales, written in the late 1300s. One of his characters, Canacee, goes to bed soon after evening falls and wakes following her first sleep, while her companions who stayed up late sleep straight through until morning. The implication was clear. The earlier you went to bed, the more likely you were to wake in the middle of the night. The later you stayed up, the more likely you were to sleep until dawn. French documents referred to it as primer sum. Italians called it primo sonno. The Romans had their own term, primus somnus, mentioned in texts going back to Homer's Odyssey in the 8th century before the Common Era. Virgil wrote about it. So did Livy. The idea appeared in African tribal cultures, in South Asian societies, in accounts from travelers to South America and the Middle East. This wasn't a quirk of one region or one time period. It was widespread, persistent, consistent across cultures and centuries. People slept, woke, did things, then slept again. And nobody thought it was strange. Eckhart kept digging. He found medical texts from the 16th and 17th centuries that discussed sleep in terms of two phases. Doctors advised their patients when to take medicines, what to eat before bed, and what activities were best suited to the period between sleeps. One French physician, Laurent Jabert, even suggested that couples would find intercourse more pleasurable and more likely to result in conception if they waited until after their first sleep, when they were rested and relaxed. He found prayer books with specific prayers meant to be said during the nighttime waking. Religious manuals that assumed readers would naturally be awake sometime after midnight and offered guidance on how to use that time spiritually. Monks and nuns had formal schedules built around this pattern, waking for midnight prayers called matins. But the practice extended far beyond religious communities. He found diaries where people casually mentioned what they did between sleeps. One man noted that he used the time to check on sick livestock. Another recorded brewing a batch of beer. A woman mentioned having a quiet conversation with her husband. These weren't special occasions or unusual circumstances. They were normal nights. And he found something else too. As the centuries progressed, as the references accumulated, he noticed a shift. By the late 1700s, mentions of first sleep and second sleep were still common, but they were beginning to decline. By the 1800s, they were becoming rarer. And by the early 1900s, they had almost completely disappeared from written records. The pattern faded at different rates in different places. Rural areas held onto it longer than cities. The poor maintained the old rhythms longer than the wealthy. But everywhere, gradually, the two-sleep pattern was replaced by the consolidated sleep we know today. And it happened so thoroughly, so completely, that within a few generations people forgot it had ever existed at all. Eckhart published his findings in 2001 in a paper called Sleep We Have Lost. It landed like a bombshell in historical circles and eventually filtered out into popular consciousness. Here was evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the way we sleep now isn't the way humans always slept. That our 8-hour standard is actually the historical anomaly, not the pattern that came before. But Eckart's research raised as many questions as it answered. If segmented sleep was so universal, why did it disappear? Was it purely cultural, a consequence of changing technology and work patterns? Or was there something biological happening? Something in our bodies and brains that made biphasic sleep natural under certain conditions? To answer that, we need to look at the science. And that's where things get even more interesting. Imagine you're living in medieval England. Not in a castle, not in a manor house with fine furnishings and servants. You're a farmer, a craftsman, someone whose life follows the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of the land. The sun is setting, the light is fading, and you're getting ready for bed. You don't have a clock to tell you it's bedtime. You don't check your phone to see if you've scrolled enough or whether you should watch one more episode. You go to bed because it's dark, because the work of the day is done, because there's not much else to do, and you're tired. In summer, that might mean going to bed around 9 or 10. In winter, when the days are short and the nights stretch long, you might retire by 7 or 8, just a few hours after the sun goes down. Your bed isn't much. A wooden frame if you're lucky, maybe just a straw mattress on the floor if you're not. The mattress is stuffed with straw or wool or feathers, depending on what you can afford. It's lumpy, it smells musty, but it's warm, and after a long day of physical labor, you're grateful for it. You share this bed. Privacy is a luxury few can afford. If you're married, you sleep with your spouse. If you have children, the youngest might sleep with you as well. If you're poor, you might share sleeping space with other family members. Maybe even with livestock in the coldest months when keeping warm matters more than keeping separate. The room is dark. Not dim, not shadowy. Dark in a way modern people rarely experience. No streetlights bleeding through the windows. No glow from electronics. No ambient light from neighbors or passing cars. Just darkness, deep and complete. You lie down. The bed creaks. The straw rustles. Someone coughs. A dog shifts by the hearth. And then, gradually, sleep comes. Not all at once, but in stages. Your breathing slows. Your body relaxes. The thoughts that chattered through your mind during the day begin to quiet. This is your first sleep. And it will last somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. During this time, you sleep deeply. Medieval people called it the dead sleep, and the name is apt. This is the deepest, most restorative phase of sleep. The time when your body does its most intensive repair work. Your muscles relax fully. Your breathing becomes slow and regular. If someone tried to wake you during this period, you'd be groggy, disoriented, reluctant to surface. But you're not disturbed. The household sleeps around you. The fire burns low in the hearth. Outside, the night settles into its own rhythm. An owl calls. Wind moves through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Hours pass. The night deepens. And then, somewhere around midnight or a bit after, something changes. You don't wake to an alarm or a noise or a disturbance. You simply wake. Naturally, gently, as if your body has decided on its own that it's time. Your eyes open in the dark. You lie still for a moment, oriented yourself. The bed is warm. Your spouse breathes steadily beside you. You're not alarmed. This isn't unusual. This is normal. This is the watch. What happens next depends on the night, on the season, on what needs doing. Sometimes you just lie there, mind drifting in that space between sleep and full wakefulness. Sometimes you pray. Christian prayer books had specific prayers for this hour, recognizing it as a time when the mind was clear and contemplative, when the distractions of the day had fallen away, and you could commune with the divine without interference. Sometimes you talk. Quiet conversation with a spouse. The kind of intimate discussion that's hard to have during the busy daylight hours. Plans for tomorrow. Worries about the harvest. Memories of the past. This was time together. Unrushed. Unhurried. A luxury in lives that were otherwise consumed with work and survival. Sometimes you think about your dreams. Medieval people put great stock in dreams. They believed dreams carried messages, warnings, insights into the future or the soul. The period between first and second sleep was considered the ideal time to reflect on what you dreamed, to parse its meaning, to remember it before the details faded. Sometimes you do practical things. You get up to tend the fire, adding wood so the coals don't die completely and leave you shivering in the cold. You check on a sick child or an ailing animal. You fetch water or relieve yourself, using the chamber pot that sits in the corner or stepping outside into the cold night air. Sometimes you work. Farmers might check on livestock. Craftsmen might prepare materials for the next day's labor. A servant in a wealthy household might brew beer between midnight and 2 in the morning, a task that needed doing but didn't fit easily into the packed daylight hours. Criminals, too, used this time, slipping through dark streets when honest folk were between their sleeps. And sometimes, often even, you had sex. This might seem like an odd detail to emphasize, but it appears again and again in the historical record. Doctors recommended it. Couples practiced it. The logic was simple. After the first sleep, you were rested. You digested your evening meal. Your body was relaxed, but not exhausted. And you had the promise of more sleep to come, so you didn't need to rush. One physician noted that manual laborers seemed to have more children than the wealthy, and he attributed it to this practice. The poor went to bed earlier, woke between sleeps at a time when their bodies were primed for conception, and enjoyed it more because they weren't too tired. Whether this was medically sound is debatable, but it reveals something about how people understood their own rhythms. The watch lasted an hour, sometimes longer. People seemed to have an internal sense of when it was time to return to sleep. You didn't need a clock to tell you. Your body knew. The same way it had known when to wake, it knew when to rest again. And so you settled back into the warmth of the bed. You pulled the blankets close. You listened to the breathing of those around you. And gradually, without effort or anxiety, sleep returns. This is your second sleep, and it will carry you through to morning. The second sleep was different from the first. Lighter, in some ways, more prone to dreams. Some researchers believe this is when most vivid dreaming occurred, in the hours just before dawn, when sleep became more shallow and the mind more active. Medieval people certainly seem to associate this period with dreams. They spoke of morning sleep as the time when visions came, when the mind wandered into strange territories. Some prayers from this era specifically addressed dreams that came during the second sleep, asking for protection from nightmares or thanking God for pleasant visions. This second phase of sleep lasted another 3 to 5 hours, roughly matching the duration of the first. When dawn came, when the first light began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, you woke again. This time for the day, you didn't leap out of bed. There was no jarring alarm, no rush to be somewhere at a specific time. You woke gradually, oriented yourself, assessed the morning. Was it raining? Cold? How much work needed doing today? What season were you in? In summer, the days were long and demanded long hours of labor, so you rose early, made the most of the light. In winter, when daylight was precious and short, you might linger in bed a bit longer, conserving energy, staying warm. The household stirred. Fires were rekindled. Breakfast, such as it was prepared. Bread, perhaps, left over from the day before. Ale or beer, safer than water. Porridge made from oats or barley, filling and warm. And then the day began, and with it the cycle would start again. Work through the daylight hours, settle in as darkness fell. First sleep, the watch, second sleep, morning. Over and over, as regular as the seasons, as predictable as the sun. This pattern wasn't rigid. It varied by person, by season, by circumstance. People who stayed up late might sleep through until morning without waking. Those who retired early were more likely to experience the watch. Monks and nuns had their own schedules, structured around prayers that came at specific hours. The wealthy, with their access to candles and lamps, could extend their evenings and compress their sleep into a shorter window. But for most people, for most of history, this was normal. Not remarkable, not noteworthy, just the way sleep happened, the rhythm of the night, and then it changed. Within a few generations, this pattern that had persisted for millennia vanished so completely that we forgot it ever existed. We'll explore why in a moment. But first, we need to understand what was actually happening in those bodies lying in medieval beds. What was going on biologically that made this pattern not just possible, but natural? In the early 1990s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health decided to run an experiment. He wanted to know what would happen to modern people's sleep if you removed one key variable, artificial light. The setup was simple but strict. He recruited volunteers, ordinary people with no particular sleep disorders, and placed them in an environment where they were exposed to light for only 10 hours a day. The rest of the time, 14 hours, they spent in complete darkness. No phones, no computers, no reading lights, just darkness. Think about that for a moment. We're so unused to this kind of darkness that it's hard to even imagine. Most of us are exposed to light for 16 hours a day or more. We wake to alarm clocks with glowing displays. We check our phones before we even get out of bed. We spend our days under artificial lights in offices and homes. We watch screens at night. Even when we finally go to bed, light bleeds in from street lamps and neighboring houses. Ware's volunteers lived differently for 4 weeks. During their 10 hours of light, they went about their normal activities. But when the lights went out, that was it. Darkness until morning. The results were striking. For the first few nights, the volunteers slept long hours, sometimes 11 or 12 hours straight. Ware interpreted this as sleep debt, the accumulated deficit most modern people carry from chronic undersleeping. The body, given the chance, was catching up. But by the 4th week, something remarkable happened. The volunteers' sleep patterns changed. They stopped sleeping in one long block. Instead, they began sleeping in 2 distinct phases, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness that lasted 1 to 3 hours. First, they would lie awake for an hour or 2 after the lights went out, not sleeping, but resting quietly in the dark. Then they would fall into a deep sleep that lasted 3 to 5 hours. They'd wake naturally, spend an hour in calm wakefulness, and then return to sleep for another 3 to 5 hours. Sound familiar? It should, because this pattern, emerging spontaneously in modern people deprived of artificial light, matched exactly what Eckhart had found in the historical record. The same 2 sleeps. The same wakeful period in between. The same total duration of around 8 hours of actual sleep. Ware measured what was happening in his volunteers' bodies during this experiment. He found that the period of wakefulness between sleeps wasn't just empty time. It was hormonally distinct. Levels of the stress hormone cortisol were low. Levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with relaxation and calm, were elevated. The volunteers weren't anxious or frustrated by being awake. They were in what Ware described as an altered state of consciousness, not unlike meditation. One journalist who accidentally fell into a biphasic sleep pattern described it similarly. Jesse Barron was normally an anxious New Yorker for whom wakefulness and worry went hand in hand. But during his unintentional middle-of-the-night wakings, he found himself unexpectedly calm. The usual mental chatter quieted. He stopped reaching for his phone. Instead, he read physical books, thought about things in a way he normally didn't have time for. Ware's experiment suggested something profound, that biphasic sleep isn't a cultural artifact or a historical quirk. It's a biological pattern that emerges naturally when humans are exposed to natural light and darkness cycles. Our bodies, given the chance, want to sleep this way. Other evidence supports this. Studies of animals show that many species engage in biphasic or even polyphasic sleep patterns. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, are awake for about 20% of their sleep period. Many mammals, birds, and insects sleep in segments rather than one continuous block. For most of evolutionary history, some researchers theorize sleeping straight through the night might have been dangerous. A group where everyone slept at exactly the same time would be vulnerable to predators. But if sleep naturally segments, if people wake at slightly different times, then someone is always semi-alert, always able to respond to danger. Ware noticed this in his experiment. The volunteers woke at different times. There was never a moment when everyone was simultaneously asleep. This so-called sentinel function, as some evolutionary biologists have termed it, might have been crucial to survival. Our ancestors who slept in segments, who had periods of wakefulness throughout the night, may have been the ones who lived long enough to pass on their genes. This remains theoretical, but it offers one possible explanation for why biphasic sleep emerges so readily when artificial lighting is removed. But if biphasic sleep is so natural, why did it disappear? Why did we shift to consolidated sleep? The answer isn't just about biology. It's about culture, technology, and the enormous changes that swept through human society starting in the late 1700s. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It crept in gradually, city by city, class by class, over more than a century. But we can trace its origins to a few key developments, each building on the last until the old pattern of sleep became untenable and a new one took its place. The first domino was lighting. Not electric lighting, Not yet. That would come later. The initial shift began with street lamps. Before street lamps, nighttime in cities was dangerous. The darkness was nearly absolute. Streets weren't just dark, they were chaotic. No sidewalks, no clear pathways, no signs to guide you. People stumbled through the gloom, occasionally carrying lanterns if they could afford them, more often just groping their way along walls and hoping they didn't trip over something or someone. Crime thrived in this darkness. Muggers, pickpockets, worse. The night belonged to those who had no choice but to be out in it. The desperate and the criminal. Honest folks stayed home after dark. Being out at night was suspicious in itself. But in 1667, Paris became the first city to install street lamps, funded by taxes and maintained by the city. Other European cities followed: London, Amsterdam, Berlin. By 1700, over 50 European cities had some form of public street lighting. The technology was simple, usually just oil lamps that needed to be lit each evening and extinguished each morning. But the effect was revolutionary. Suddenly, streets were navigable at night. You could go to a tavern after dark and find your way home. You could visit a friend. You could conduct business. Night became less of a barrier, less of a hard stop at the end of the day. The boundary between day and night, once absolute, began to soften. This change affected sleep in subtle ways. If you could stay out later, you might go to bed later. If you went to bed later, you were less likely to wake naturally in the middle of the night. The first sleep might blend into the second or disappear entirely. Then came gas lighting in the early 1800s. Gas lamps were brighter than oil lamps, more reliable, easier to maintain. Cities that adopted gas lighting could light more streets more thoroughly for longer hours. Baltimore began installing gas lighting in 1816 and 1817, becoming one of the first cities in the United States to adopt the technology. Others followed rapidly. Gas lighting didn't just make streets safer. It made nighttime socializing normal. Restaurants stayed open later. Theaters performed evening shows. Shopping could happen after dark. The night, for those who could afford to participate in it, became an extension of the day. And then, of course, came electricity. Thomas Edison's light bulb, commercially available in the 1880s, changed everything. Electric lights were brighter, cleaner, safer than anything that had come before. You could have light in every room of your house. You could read at midnight without eye strain. You could work through the night if you chose. Edison himself supposedly said he created the light bulb because he believed humans should be able to keep working late into the night. Whether or not he actually said this, his invention certainly made it possible. Factories could operate around the clock. Offices could extend their hours. The tyranny of darkness, as some called it, was broken. But along with this liberation came a cost. Our circadian rhythms, the internal biological clocks that regulate our sleep-wake cycles, evolved in a world of natural light and darkness. Bright light in the evening suppresses melatonin, the hormone that signals to our bodies that it's time to sleep. When we expose ourselves to artificial light at night, especially the blue wavelengths emitted by screens, we're essentially telling our brains it's still day. Bedtime gets pushed later, and when it does, sleep consolidates. The second major force was industrialization. Factories needed workers who showed up at the same time, worked the same shifts, followed the same schedules. You couldn't run a production line if half your workers were waking up between their sleeps and the other half were sleeping straight through. Standardization became essential. The 8-hour workday, fought for by labor movements and eventually adopted widely, reinforced this. If you're working 8 hours, commuting, maintaining a household, you don't have time for leisurely nighttime wakings. Sleep becomes something to compress, to make efficient. Get your 8 hours and get back to work. This efficiency mindset fundamentally changed how people thought about sleep. It stopped being a natural process that unfolded over the course of the night and became a commodity, something to manage and optimize. Doctors began writing about sleep hygiene. Advice manuals recommended going to bed at a specific time and waking at a specific time every day, like clockwork. The invention of the alarm clock both reflected and reinforced this shift. The first mechanical alarm clock was created in 1787 by Levi Hutchins, specifically to wake him for work. But alarm clocks didn't become widespread until the late 1800s and early 1900s, when mass production made them affordable and factory schedules made them necessary. Think about what an alarm clock represents. It's a device designed to interrupt natural sleep, to force wakefulness regardless of whether your body is ready. Before alarm clocks, people woke when their bodies woke them, usually with the light of dawn. After alarm clocks, sleep had a deadline. Schools contributed too. Compulsory education, which became widespread in the late 1800s, meant children needed to wake at the same time each day, arrive at school on schedule. Parents couldn't let children sleep in two phases if they needed to be dressed, fed, and out the door by 8 in the morning. Even parenting books from the 1820s advised weaning children from the two-sleep pattern as early as possible, preparing them for the demands of modern life. All of these changes worked together, each reinforcing the others, until by the early 1900s, the old pattern had become rare. References to first sleep and second sleep disappeared from common usage. The words themselves were forgotten. Within a generation or two, segmented sleep went from normal to non-existent. Or rather, from normal to pathologized. Because people didn't stop waking in the middle of the night. They just started thinking something was wrong when they did. The first medical references to middle-of-the-night insomnia appear in the late 1800s. Right around the same time that mentions of segmented sleep start disappearing. This timing isn't coincidental. As consolidated sleep became the standard, natural nighttime waking became a disorder. People who woke at 2 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep immediately were told they had a problem. Doctors prescribed remedies. Patent medicines promising restful sleep flooded the market. The idea took hold that healthy people slept straight through the night, and if you didn't, something was wrong with you. This created anxiety, and anxiety makes sleep problems worse. If you wake in the middle of the night and think it's normal, you relax, maybe read a bit, pray, think about things, and eventually drift back to sleep. But if you wake and think you're broken, your heart races, your mind spins, and sleep becomes elusive. We created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By deciding that consolidated sleep was normal, we turned natural waking into a source of stress. And stress, of course, interferes with sleep. We took a biological pattern that had worked for millennia and pathologized it into existence. Some historians and sleep researchers now believe that much of what we call insomnia might actually be an expression of our natural sleep pattern trying to assert itself in an environment that no longer supports it. When people wake at 2 in the morning and can't get back to sleep, they might not be experiencing a disorder. They might be experiencing the watch. This doesn't mean all insomnia is just misunderstood segmented sleep. True sleep disorders exist, and they require treatment. But it does suggest that some of what we've labeled as pathological might actually be natural. Our body's trying to follow a rhythm we've culturally erased. So what did we lose when we lost segmented sleep? And what does this history mean for how we understand sleep today? In the rush to modernize, to make sleep efficient and consolidated, we gave up something the people once valued. That quiet time in the middle of the night wasn't wasted time. It served purposes we've largely forgotten. First, it was time for reflection. The medieval watch, that hour or more between sleeps, was described in historical sources as a period of unusual clarity. The mind was rested but not yet burdened with the demands of the day. Thoughts came easily, without the usual mental clutter. Some people used this time to pray, and they described their prayers during the watch as more focused, more meaningful than prayers said at other times. Others used it to think about dreams. In a world without psychology, without therapy, dreams were taken seriously as messages from the divine or insights into the soul. The watch was when you could reflect on what you dreamed while the memory was still fresh, before the details faded. Some historians believe this gave medieval people a different relationship with their unconscious minds, a way of processing emotions and experiences that we've lost. Second, it was time for intimacy. Not just sexual intimacy, though that was part of it, but emotional intimacy. Couples lying in bed together, talking in the dark, sharing thoughts and worries without the distractions of daylight. In lives that were often communal, where privacy was rare, the watch offered a bubble of togetherness. Some marriage historians believe this contributed to stronger partnerships. You had built-in time to connect, to communicate, to maintain the emotional bonds that kept relationships intact. Modern couples often struggle to find time for each other, grabbing conversations in snippets between work and children and errands. Medieval couples had the watch. Third, it was time for practical work that didn't fit elsewhere. The servant brewing beer between midnight and 2 in the morning wasn't doing it for fun. Beer was essential, safer than water, and brewing took time. If you were busy all day with other tasks, the watch was when you could get it done. Similarly, for other chores that required attention, but not daylight. Tending fires, checking on sick animals, preparing materials for the next day's work. This wasn't ideal, of course. It would be nice if people didn't have to work in the middle of the night. But it speaks to how thoroughly the watch was integrated into daily life, how it was used and valued rather than fought against. And fourth, it might have been better for our mental health. Some sleep researchers and psychiatrists now speculate that the loss of segmented sleep could be connected to rising rates of anxiety and depression in modern societies. This is controversial and hard to prove, but the logic goes like this. We evolved to have quiet, reflective time in the middle of the night. Time when the mind could process, sort, integrate the experiences of the day without external stimulation. When we compressed sleep into one block and filled our waking hours with constant activity and input, we lost that processing time. We lost the mental equivalent of defragging a hard drive. And maybe, just maybe, that contributes to the sense many people have of being overwhelmed, of never quite catching up with themselves. Ware's experiment supports this idea. Remember, his volunteers during their wakeful periods between sleeps experienced elevated prolactin and low cortisol. They were physiologically in a state of calm that modern people rarely access. One volunteer described it as meditative. Another said it was the most relaxed he'd felt in years. We don't have the cultural structures to support this anymore. We can't tell our employers we need to sleep in 2 phases. We can't restructure schools around the watch. And most of us, given the choice between sleeping through the night and waking at 2 in the morning to lie in the dark, would choose the former. But understanding that segmented sleep was once normal, that it might even be natural under certain conditions, changes how we can think about our own sleep struggles. If you wake at 2 in the morning, you don't have to panic. You're not necessarily broken or disordered. You might just be experiencing an echo of an older pattern. And if you stop fighting it, stop worrying about it, you might find that sleep returns on its own, just as it did for people throughout history. Some sleep specialists now recommend exactly this approach. If you wake in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep immediately, don't lie there stressing about it. Get up. Do something quiet and low-key. Read by dim light. Pray if that's meaningful to you. Think about your day, your dreams, your life. And when you feel sleepy again, go back to bed. This is essentially recreating the watch. Not because we're trying to live like medieval people, but because this pattern might be closer to what our bodies naturally want to do. It won't work for everyone. Some people genuinely do sleep better in one consolidated block, and that's fine. Sleep is individual. What works varies person to person. But for those who struggle with middle-of-the-night waking, who've tried everything else and found no relief, maybe the answer isn't to fight the waking. Maybe it's to accept it, to work with it instead of against it. There's also something profound in recognizing that the way we live now, the schedules we keep, the sleep we chase, isn't inevitable. It's a choice, or rather a series of choices made over generations in response to technological and economic changes. We could make different choices. We could structure our lives differently. Probably we won't, not on a societal level. The forces that created consolidated sleep, the artificial lighting and standardized work schedules, aren't going away. But individually, we can question the assumptions we've inherited. We can ask whether the 8-hour standard really serves us. We can be gentler with ourselves when our sleep doesn't look the way we've been told it should. And we can remember that for most of human history, sleep wasn't something to optimize or perfect or stress about. It was something that happened naturally, in its own rhythm, with its own patterns. Sometimes in one phase, sometimes in two. People adapted to their circumstances, to the seasons, to their own bodies. They weren't trying to hack their sleep or achieve some ideal state. They were just sleeping. And in that unself-conscious acceptance, there might be a lesson for us. The story of segmented sleep is about more than just sleep. It's about how we understand ourselves, our bodies, our place in history. It's a reminder that we're not as modern as we think, that the past lives in us in ways we don't always recognize. When you wake at 2 in the morning, when your eyes open in the dark and you lie there wondering what's wrong, remember, your medieval ancestors might have been doing the exact same thing. Not because they were troubled or anxious, but because it was time for the watch. Time to pray or talk or think or simply be awake in the gentle quiet of the night. They would have known that sleep would return, that there was no rush, no deadline, no need to force it. They would have trusted the rhythm, let it unfold, and perhaps, just perhaps, we could learn to do the same. So tonight, if you wake in the dark hours, don't fight it. Don't reach for your phone or turn on bright lights or lie there calculating how many hours you have left before morning. Just be awake. Breathe. Let your mind wander where it will. Think about the people throughout history who did exactly this, who woke in the middle of the night and used that time, valued it, lived through it. You're not broken. You're not disordered. You're human. And humans, it turns out, have been waking in the middle of the night for as long as we've been sleeping at all. If this journey through the forgotten rhythms of sleep brought you some peace, some understanding, maybe even some relief from the anxiety of your own nighttime wakings, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But only if it genuinely helped. Only if you found something here worth keeping. And let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen to this. There's something beautiful in knowing that while we no longer share the watch, we still share the night. People across time zones and continents, all drifting off to the same old stories about how our ancestors slept and dreamed and woke in the dark. Sleep well, or don't. Either way, you're doing just fine. But before you drift off completely, there's another surprising truth about medieval life that challenges everything we think we know. Because the same peasants who slept in 2 phases, who lived in those rough cottages and ate simple meals, had something else that might shock you. Something that, paradoxically, the wealthy nobles envied even if they never admitted it. They had better teeth. Yes, you read that correctly. The average medieval peasant with no toothbrush, no dentist, no fluoride, had healthier teeth than a king. And the reason why tells us another story about how our modern assumptions can be spectacularly wrong. A story about sugar, status, and the slow rot of luxury. Let's talk about the sugar trap. When you picture a medieval peasant, you probably imagine someone with a mouthful of blackened, rotting teeth. Someone who grimaces when they bite down, who avoids smiling, whose breath could curdle milk at 10 paces. This image is everywhere in movies and television, part of our collective understanding of what it meant to be poor and medieval. And it's almost entirely wrong. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. When researchers examined skeletal remains from medieval burial sites, particularly those in rural areas where peasants were buried, they find something unexpected. The teeth are remarkably healthy. Not perfect. There's wear, certainly, from a lifetime of chewing bread, made with stone-ground flour that contained tiny particles of grit. But decay? Cavities? Abscesses? Far less common than you'd expect. Studies of medieval remains show that only about 20% of teeth excavated from peasant burial sites showed any sign of decay. 20%. Compare that to early 20th century populations, where decay appeared on 90% of teeth. Or to modern America, where half of all teenagers have cavities despite fluoride toothpaste, regular dental cleanings, and a century of dental science. The medieval peasant, it turns out, had better dental health than most people living today. How is that possible? How could someone living in what we consider primitive, unhygienic conditions, someone who never saw a dentist in their entire life, have healthier teeth than someone with access to modern dental care? The answer is surprisingly simple. Diet. Medieval peasants ate very little sugar, not because they were disciplined or health conscious, but because sugar was staggeringly expensive. It was a luxury item imported from distant lands at great cost, available only to the wealthy. And even when the rich could afford it, they used it sparingly in the early medieval period, more as a medicine or spice than as a food. The peasant diet was built on grains, vegetables, and dairy. Rye bread, barley porridge, cabbage, leeks, turnips, cheese, and the occasional bit of salted fish or pork. Bland, yes. Repetitive, absolutely. But from a dental perspective, nearly ideal. High in calcium from dairy products, which strengthen teeth. High in fiber from vegetables and whole grains. And critically, low in the refined sugars that feed the bacteria responsible for tooth decay. When peasants did encounter sweetness, it came from natural sources. An apple in autumn, a handful of berries picked from the hedgerow, honey, if they were lucky enough to keep bees or trade for it. These natural sugars were consumed rarely and in small amounts, not enough to cause significant dental problems. Medieval people did care about their teeth. They wanted white teeth and fresh breath, the same things we want today. And they developed surprisingly effective methods for maintaining both, given the limitations of their knowledge and technology. They cleaned their teeth with rough linen cloths, rubbing them vigorously to remove food particles and plaque. Some used small twigs, chewing one end until it frayed into a brush-like texture, then using it to scrub their teeth. Hazel twigs were particularly popular for this. And it turns out, modern research has shown, some of these plants contain natural antibacterial compounds. The medieval peasant choosing a hazel twig wasn't doing it because they understood chemistry. They did it because it worked, and knowledge of what worked was passed down through generations. The technique was straightforward, but required daily commitment. You'd select a fresh twig, preferably from a tree known for its cleaning properties. Hazel was common, but willow, oak, and birch were also used. You'd chew one end, mashing the wood fibers until they separated into a brush-like fan. Then you'd use this improvised brush to scrub each tooth, working the bristles along the gum line where food tended to accumulate. Some regions had their preferred variations. In parts of southern Europe, people used aromatic woods like juniper or pine, which left a pleasant taste and scent. In areas near the Mediterranean, they sometimes used olive twigs. The practice was universal enough that nearly every medieval person would have known how to prepare and use a chewing stick. For fresh breath, they chewed on herbs. Mint, parsley, sage, rosemary, fennel. These weren't just pleasant-smelling plants chosen at random. Medieval herbalists recognized that certain herbs seemed to improve oral health, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. Mint, for instance, contains compounds that actually do inhibit bacterial growth. Parsley contains chlorophyll, which helps neutralize odors. They made pastes and powders from crushed herbs mixed with salt, rubbing these onto their teeth and gums. Salt, being mildly abrasive, helped scrub away buildup. Combined with the antibacterial properties of the herbs, these pastes were surprisingly effective at maintaining basic oral hygiene. Some recipes survive in medieval medical texts. One common formula called for sage, rosemary, pepper, and salt, ground together into a fine powder. Another recommended mint leaves crushed with burned bread crust and salt. Still another suggested a mixture of cinnamon, cloves, and mace, expensive spices that only the wealthy could afford, creating yet another class distinction in dental care. They even had a form of mouthwash, vinegar-based mixtures infused with pleasant-smelling herbs. Vinegar's acidity helped kill bacteria and remove stains. Infused with mint or sage, it served as a rudimentary antiseptic rinse. The taste must have been aggressively sour, but it worked. Beyond these daily practices, medieval people had remedies for specific dental problems. For toothaches, they might pack the painful area with clove oil, which contains eugenol, a natural anesthetic and antiseptic still used in dentistry today. They might chew willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They might apply poultices of crushed herbs to infected gums. For whitening teeth, which was considered important for appearance, they used powders made from crushed pumice stone or finely ground chalk. These were abrasive enough to remove surface stains, but not so harsh as to damage enamel significantly. Some recipes included burned rosemary or sage ash, believing the white color of the ash would transfer whiteness to the teeth. It didn't work that way, of course, but the mild abrasiveness probably did remove some discoloration. There were even medieval dental handbooks, though calling them handbooks might be generous. Scattered through medical manuscripts were sections on oral health, offering advice that ranged from sound to superstitious. Some recommended avoiding extremely hot or cold foods, which is reasonable given how temperature extremes can aggravate sensitive teeth. Others suggested wearing amulets or reciting specific prayers, which was less effective but provided psychological comfort. The better medieval medical writers understood the connection between diet and dental health, even if they didn't know about bacteria or acid. They observed that people who ate more bread and vegetables had healthier teeth than those who consumed lots of sweet wine and preserved fruits. They noticed that tooth decay seemed to cluster in families, not realizing it was because dietary habits were passed from parent to child. None of this was as effective as modern dental care, of course. Medieval people still lost teeth. They still suffered from gum disease and abscesses. The wear from stone-ground grain was a particular problem. As bread was milled using heavy stone wheels, tiny particles of the stone inevitably mixed into the flour. Over a lifetime of eating this bread, teeth wore down significantly. Deep crevices in molars were ground nearly flat. But here's an interesting twist. Some dental researchers speculate this wear might have had an unexpected benefit. The deep grooves and fissures in back teeth are where cavities often start, providing protected spaces for bacteria to accumulate. When those grooves were worn smooth by gritty bread, there were fewer places for decay to take hold. The peasant's rough diet might have accidentally provided a crude form of preventive care. Still, the wear eventually became a problem in itself. Teeth worn down to the gum line were sensitive and sometimes painful. Older peasants often had difficulty chewing, which limited their diet to softer foods and potentially contributed to malnutrition in their final years. And because their diet was naturally low in sugar, because they weren't constantly bathing their teeth in the acids produced by bacteria feeding on refined carbohydrates, these simple hygiene practices were enough to keep most peasants' teeth in relatively good condition throughout most of their lives. Not perfect, not pain-free, but functional. Healthy enough that tooth loss from decay wasn't the major problem we might imagine. Archaeological studies bear this out. When researchers examine skulls from medieval peasant cemeteries, they find something remarkable. Yes, there's wear. Yes, there are occasional cavities. But the overall dental health is surprisingly good, especially compared to skeletal remains from just a few centuries later. One study of remains from Wareham Percy, a deserted medieval village in Yorkshire, found that about 68% of individuals had some cavities. That sounds high until you compare it to a 19th century London cemetery, where 79% showed decay. The medieval peasants, with no professional dental care whatsoever, had better outcomes than Victorian city dwellers with access to dentists. The difference was diet. The Victorian poor consumed cheap sugar in their tea, in their jam, in the sweets they bought from street vendors. The medieval peasant had none of these options. They were, in a very real sense, protected by poverty. Now contrast that with the nobility. If you were wealthy in medieval Europe, sugar was a status symbol. It announced to everyone at your table that you had money, power, connections to distant trade routes. Sugar was exotic. It came from far away, the Middle East initially, later from Mediterranean islands like Cyprus and Sicily. It arrived in small quantities on ships that had traveled for months, passing through the hands of multiple merchants, each adding their markup. By the time sugar reached the nobleman's table, it was worth its weight in silver, sometimes even gold. And precisely because it was so expensive, it became a way to demonstrate wealth. The more sugar you could afford to consume, the more successful you appeared. The history of sugar's journey to Europe is itself remarkable. Sugarcane originated in New Guinea, where people had been chewing the stalks for their sweet juice for thousands of years. From there, it spread to India, where the process of refining cane juice into granulated crystals was developed. By the 6th century CE, sugar cultivation and refining had reached Persia. Arab traders brought sugar to the Mediterranean during the medieval Islamic expansion. The word sugar itself comes from the Arabic sukar, which came from the Persian shakar, which in turn came from the Sanskrit sharkara. Each culture that encountered sugar adapted it, refined it, and passed it on. The Crusades of the 11th through 13th centuries introduced European nobles to sugar in larger quantities. Crusaders tasted it in the Middle East and brought it back home as an exotic curiosity. It was expensive, yes, but for those who could afford it, sugar offered a taste of the Orient, a connection to distant lands of spice and silk. Venice became the primary European trading post for sugar. Venetian merchants controlled much of the Mediterranean trade, including sugar from Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily. They became wealthy beyond measure, and sugar was one of their most profitable commodities. In the early medieval period, sugar was used cautiously, a pinch to season a sauce, a small amount as a preservative, sometimes as medicine. Medieval physicians believed sugar had healing properties, that it could cure ailments ranging from coughs to digestive troubles to melancholy. This medicinal use gave sugar an additional prestige beyond mere flavor. Medical texts from the period list sugar as a treatment for dozens of conditions. Got a cough? Sugar. Upset stomach? Sugar. Feeling weak? Sugar. The logic seemed to be that something so sweet and pleasant must be fundamentally good for the body. And to be fair, for undernourished medieval people, the quick calories provided by sugar might actually have provided temporary relief from fatigue or weakness. But as the centuries progressed, as trade routes expanded and sugar became slightly more available, though still expensive, the wealthy began using it more liberally. By the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, sugar had become a culinary statement. Wealthy households served elaborate sugar sculptures at banquets. Entire castles, animals, mythological scenes, ships with full rigging, all crafted from molded and colored sugar. These subtleties, as they were called, were meant to astonish guests, to showcase the host's wealth and sophistication. Creating them required specialized craftsmen, sugar workers who spent days or weeks constructing these edible monuments to excess. The sculptures could be enormous. Records from a 1591 banquet hosted for Queen Elizabeth. I described sugar sculptures of every imaginable beast. Lions, unicorns, bears, horses, camels, bulls, rams, the dogs, elephants, antelopes, dromedaries, apes, and more. An entire menagerie rendered in crystallized sweetness, representing a fortune in imported luxury. And they ate it too. The sculptures were meant to be admired, yes, but also consumed. After being displayed and exclaimed over, they would be broken apart and distributed to guests. Eating a piece of a sugar unicorn was proof you'd attended an important event, hosted by someone important. Beyond the sculptures, sugar infiltrated the cuisine of the wealthy in increasingly creative ways. Candied fruits became popular, with everything from orange peel to ginger preserved in thick sugar syrup. Spiced cakes heavy with honey and sugar appeared at feasts. Sweet wines, already popular, became sweeter. Preserves and jams, made possible by sugar's preservative properties, allowed the wealthy to enjoy the taste of summer fruits year-round. Desserts that modern palates would find almost inedibly sweet became fashionable. Medieval recipes for sweet pies often called for equal parts fruit and sugar, creating a cloying intensity that today would be considered excessive. But for people whose everyday diet was bland and repetitive, that intensity was part of the appeal. The wealthy developed a taste for sugar, and they indulged it as often as they could afford to, which was often. Sugar consumption became a marker of sophistication, of refinement, of participation in the culture of luxury that defined the upper classes. Etiquette guides from the period advised on the proper way to serve sugar delicacies. Should the subtlety be presented before or after the main courses? How should candied fruits be arranged on the table? What was the appropriate way to eat a sugar-dusted cake without appearing greedy? These questions mattered in a world where social status was performed at every meal. This had predictable consequences for their teeth. By the 14th and 15th centuries, tooth decay had become associated with the upper classes. Nobles and royals suffered from cavities, abscesses, and gum disease at rates that would have been shocking to their peasant contemporaries. And unlike the peasants, who could at least maintain their teeth through simple hygiene, the wealthy were fighting a losing battle. No amount of herb paste or linen rubbing could counteract the damage being done by constant sugar consumption. The pain must have been considerable. Without modern pain relief, a severe toothache was a form of torture. Abscesses could cause swelling, fever, and agonizing throbbing pain that made sleep impossible. Gum disease led to bleeding, sensitivity, and the slow loosening of teeth. And yet, despite experiencing these consequences firsthand, the wealthy continued consuming sugar. The social pressure to participate in luxury dining was too strong. To refuse sugar when it was offered would have seemed bizarre, possibly even insulting to your host. Sugar had become so embedded in the culture of wealth that abstaining was not really an option. The irony deepened in the Elizabethan era, when sugar consumption among the English nobility reached new heights. Queen Elizabeth I herself was famously fond of sweets. She loved candied violets, sugar-dusted delicacies, sweet wines, and elaborate desserts. And she paid the price for it. Foreign diplomats who met the Queen remarked, often with barely concealed shock, on her blackened teeth. Her smile, once presumably lovely, had become a cautionary tale. The same woman who commanded an empire, who defeated the Spanish Armada, whose reign is remembered as a golden age, had teeth so decayed they had turned black. And here's where it gets truly strange. Blackened teeth became fashionable. Not intentionally, of course. No one wanted tooth decay. But among the upper classes, darkened teeth became such a common sight that they began to be associated with wealth and status. If your teeth were black, it meant you could afford sugar. It meant you were important enough to indulge in expensive luxuries. Some members of the lower classes, desperate to appear more prosperous than they were, actually used soot or charcoal to artificially blacken their own teeth. They mimicked decay to mimic status. It's hard to imagine a clearer example of how disconnected status symbols can become from actual well-being. But the nobles weren't just suffering from discolored teeth. The decay went deeper. Cavities ate through enamel and into the pulp of teeth. Abscesses formed, painful and dangerous. Gum disease set in. Teeth loosened and fell out. And because medieval dentistry was, to put it mildly, primitive, there wasn't much to be done about it. The main treatment for a toothache was extraction. The local barber, who also performed surgery when physicians wouldn't, would pull the offending tooth with pliers or similar tools. There was no anesthetic beyond getting drunk beforehand, which was both the standard recommendation and probably necessary to endure the procedure. The lucky ones, the very wealthy, might have access to slightly more skilled practitioners who could attempt other treatments. There were remedies for mouth infections, mostly involving herbal poultices or cauterization, which was exactly as painful as it sounds. Some even had dentures made from cow bone or from other human teeth, pulled from the dead or the desperately poor who sold their healthy teeth for money. King Richard III, whose remains were discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester in 2012, provides a perfect example. Analysis of his skeleton revealed that he had terrible dental health. Multiple teeth showed signs of severe decay. Some had been removed, likely painfully, during his life. This was a king, someone with access to the best medical care available in 15th century England. And yet his teeth were a disaster. The reason was simple. Richard III could afford sugar. He could afford sweetened wine, candied fruits, honey cakes, all the delicacies that his status entitled him to. And his teeth paid the price. Meanwhile, the peasants working his lands, eating their simple diet of bread and porridge and vegetables, maintained relatively healthy teeth well into middle age and beyond, even without any professional dental care whatsoever. The scientific explanation for this disparity is straightforward. When you eat sugar, the bacteria in your mouth feast on it. As they metabolize the sugar, they produce acid as a waste product. That acid attacks tooth enamel, the hard protective coating on your teeth. Given enough time and enough sugar, the acid eats through the enamel and into the softer dentin beneath, creating cavities. Medieval nobles, consuming sugar regularly, were giving the bacteria in their mouths a constant fuel supply. The acid production never stopped. Their teeth were under perpetual assault, and without fluoride or modern dental interventions, there was nothing to slow the decay. Peasants, eating a low-sugar diet, gave the bacteria very little to work with. The occasional apple or bit of honey wasn't enough to cause significant problems. Their teeth remained strong, not despite their poverty, but in some ways because of it. There's a broader lesson here, beyond dental health. The medieval period shows us that what we consider markers of civilization and progress, things like access to exotic luxury goods, aren't always beneficial. Sometimes poverty protects. The peasant couldn't afford sugar, and so they were spared its consequences. The noble could afford it, indulged in it, and suffered for it. This pattern would repeat and intensify as history moved forward. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as European powers established colonies in the Caribbean and South America, sugar production exploded. What had once been a rare luxury became increasingly common, at least among those who could afford it. Sugar plantations, worked by enslaved people under horrific conditions, churned out massive quantities of sugar that flowed back to Europe. The transformation happened remarkably quickly. Christopher Columbus brought sugarcane to the Caribbean on his second voyage in 1493. His San Diego established one of the first sugar mills in the New World at Sevilla la Nueva in Jamaica in 1515, capable of producing 150 tons of sugar per year. Within decades, sugar cultivation spread across the Caribbean islands. The Portuguese pioneered the plantation model in Brazil in the 1550s, and the Dutch, English, and French quickly followed with their own Caribbean colonies. Barbados became one massive sugar factory by the 1640s. Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, countless islands transformed their landscapes into endless fields of swaying sugarcane. This wasn't just agriculture. It was industrial-scale exploitation. The labor required to grow, harvest, and process sugarcane was backbreaking and dangerous. The cane had to be cut by hand with machetes, heavy work under the tropical sun. It had to be processed quickly after cutting, before the sucrose content degraded, which meant round-the-clock shifts at the mills. Workers fed cane stalks into crushing rollers, risking their limbs. They tended boiling vats of cane juice, standing in hellish heat, breathing toxic fumes. European indentured servants couldn't sustain this labor. Tropical diseases killed them, The indigenous populations of the Caribbean islands had already been decimated by European diseases and violence. So the plantation owners turned to enslaved Africans, who they believed had greater resistance to tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever. The numbers are staggering. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic as part of the slave trade. Many of them ended up on sugar plantations. By the 18th century, some Caribbean islands had enslaved populations that outnumbered Europeans by ratios of 10 to 1 or higher. The sugar these enslaved people produced became the foundation of European wealth. By the 1700s, sugar was the most important internationally traded commodity in the world. It was responsible for a third of the entire European economy. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar plantations funded the rise of merchant classes in Britain, France, and the Netherlands. It built cities, financed wars, and accelerated the Industrial Revolution. And it rotted teeth across an entire continent. The environmental and human cost of this trade is a story too large and too tragic to fully explore here. But the result was clear. Sugar became more available, prices fell, and consumption soared among the middle and upper classes. In England, sugar transformed from exotic spice to daily staple in less than 2 centuries. In 1600, England imported about 1,000 tons of sugar per year. By 1700, that number had increased to 10,000 tons. By 1800, it was over 150,000 tons. And this was just England. Similar patterns played out across Europe. Tea became the vehicle for much of this sugar consumption. When tea drinking became popular in Britain in the late 17th century, it was initially consumed without sweetener. But as sugar became more affordable, the British began adding it to their tea. By the 18th century, sweet tea had become a national habit, consumed by everyone from aristocrats in their drawing rooms to factory workers during their breaks. Coffee followed a similar path. Chocolate, too. All three were bitter beverages in their natural form, made palatable to European tastes by the addition of sugar. The more sugar became available, the more it was consumed, creating a reinforcing cycle of demand and production. The sugar refineries that processed raw cane sugar into the white crystals European consumers preferred became major industries in themselves. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, Amsterdam, and Hamburg built entire economies around sugar refining. The refineries used vast amounts of coal to heat the copper vans that boiled and clarified the sugar, making them early examples of industrial-scale manufacturing. Workers in these cities, even those far from the plantations, participated in the sugar economy. Dockhands unloaded sugar ships. Coopers made barrels for sugar transport. Refiners boiled and filtered the raw product. And everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest dock worker, consumed the final result. By the Victorian era in the 19th century, sugar had become so commonplace that it was considered a basic necessity rather than a luxury. Working-class families budgeted for sugar the same way they budgeted for bread or coal. Children grew up with constant access to sweets. Confectionery shops proliferated. Cakes, biscuits, candies, jams, all heavily sweetened, became standard parts of the British and European diet. By the 18th century, sugar was no longer just for the very wealthy. It had become a staple of British and European diets. Sweetening tea, coffee, and chocolate, all newly popular beverages. Workers drank sugary tea during breaks, using it as a quick source of calories to fuel long shifts in factories. What had once been a status symbol was now a daily necessity for people across the economic spectrum, and dental health declined accordingly. The records from 18th and 19th century cemeteries show a dramatic increase in tooth decay compared to medieval burial sites. By the Victorian era, dental problems were endemic. Everyone's teeth were rotting, not just the rich. Dentistry as a profession was born largely in response to this crisis, developing techniques for filling cavities, extracting teeth, and later creating dentures and bridges. The 20th century brought fluoride, better hygiene education, and antibiotics, which slowed the epidemic of decay. But even today, with all our modern dental technology, we haven't fully recovered the dental health that medieval peasants enjoyed simply by virtue of not having access to refined sugar. When you think about it, the whole trajectory is absurd. We take a naturally rare substance, refine it, concentrate it, make it cheap and ubiquitous, build entire cuisines around it, and then spend enormous resources trying to mitigate the damage it does to our bodies. And we call this progress. The medieval peasant would probably be baffled by the whole arrangement. Why would you deliberately eat something that rots your teeth? Why would you pay for that privilege? But then, they never had the choice. Sugar simply wasn't available to them. For the wealthy medieval noble, there was a choice, at least in theory. But the social pressure to demonstrate status, to participate in the culture of luxury, to show that you could afford sugar, made that choice almost impossible. To abstain from sugar when you could afford, it would have seemed bizarre, possibly even insulting to your guests. And so they ate it, smiled their blackening smiles, and suffered in ways the peasants never had to. There's something deeply human in this story. We create our own problems, often out of our greatest successes. We solve one challenge, access to calories and pleasure, and immediately create another, how to avoid the consequences of abundance. We chase status markers that harm us. We mistake what's expensive for what's valuable. We forget that sometimes limitations protect us. The medieval peasant, waking in the middle of the night during their watch, lying in the dark thinking about the day ahead, probably never considered that their simple diet was giving them an advantage over kings. They just ate what they could afford and got on with life. And when they smiled, which perhaps they did more often than we imagine, their teeth were white. So what connects these two stories? The sleep we've lost and the teeth we've ruined? On the surface, they seem unrelated. One is about rest, the other about diet. One concerns darkness and light, the other sugar and status. But look deeper, and you'll see the same pattern. Both stories are about how technological progress and economic change transformed human life in ways we didn't fully understand until long after the damage was done. Both show us how things we consider normal, sleeping 8 hours straight, eating sugar daily, are actually recent innovations that our bodies haven't necessarily adapted to well. When electric lights replaced the natural rhythm of day and night, we lost segmented sleep and gained the modern sleep crisis. When cheap sugar replaced the natural scarcity that had limited consumption for millennia, we lost our dental health and gained an epidemic of decay. In both cases, we didn't make a conscious choice as a society. We didn't sit down and say, let's consolidate our sleep, or let's eat sugar constantly. It just happened gradually, as new technologies and economic systems made certain behaviors possible and then inevitable. The medieval peasant had no choice but to sleep when darkness fell and wake when their body naturally segmented sleep. They had no choice but to avoid sugar because it was impossibly expensive. And because of those constraints, they inadvertently maintained patterns that were probably healthier than ours. When the constraints were removed, when artificial light made it possible to stay awake later, when sugar became cheap enough for daily consumption, we rushed toward the new possibilities without stopping to consider what we might be losing. This is the trap of progress. Every advance brings benefits, obviously. Electric lights are wonderful. They allow us to be productive, to read and work and socialize long after sunset. Sugar makes food taste better. It provides quick energy. It brings pleasure to meals that might otherwise be monotonous. But every advance also brings costs, often hidden costs that don't become apparent for generations. We gain convenience and lose natural rhythms. We gain pleasure and lose health. And by the time we realize what we've traded away, it's almost impossible to go back. You can't uninvent the light bulb. You can't make sugar rare again. The genie doesn't go back in the bottle. What you can do, perhaps, is recognize the pattern. You can understand that our modern lifestyle, the way we sleep, the way we eat, isn't the only way humans have ever lived. It's not even the way humans have usually lived. It's an experiment, really, less than 2 centuries old in most of its particulars. And like any experiment, it has results. Some good, some bad, some still unclear. The research on segmented sleep suggests that for some people, the 8-hour consolidated block we're told to aim for might not be natural. When you wake at 2 a.m. and can't fall back asleep immediately, you're not necessarily insomniac. You might just be experiencing the watch, that period of quiet wakefulness that used to be a normal part of the night. If you stop fighting it, if you get up and do something calm for an hour, you might find that sleep returns naturally. You might discover a rhythm that feels right in a way that forcing yourself to lie in bed, stressing about lost hours never did. The research on sugar and dental health suggests that our constant consumption of sweets isn't inevitable either. Medieval peasants proved that humans can live perfectly well, can enjoy their food and lead full lives on a diet that's naturally low in refined sugar. We've just structured our entire food system around sugar now, making it difficult to avoid even if you want to. But difficult isn't impossible, and understanding the history helps. When you know that sugar was once a rare luxury that people consumed sparingly, it's easier to see our modern relationship with it as strange. When you know that daily sugar consumption is a recent development in human history, it's easier to question whether it's really necessary. Both stories, sleep and sugar, point to a larger truth about human health and happiness. We are evolved creatures. Our bodies and brains developed over hundreds of thousands of years in environments very different from the one we live in now. We're adapted to darkness and light following natural cycles. We're adapted to sugar being rare and special. When we drastically change our environment, our biology doesn't change with it. Not in a few generations. Not even in a few thousand years. We're still essentially the same creatures we were 10,000 years ago, just living in radically different circumstances. And sometimes those circumstances hurt us, not intentionally. Not because progress is bad, but because we're complex biological systems, and complex systems don't always respond well to rapid change. The medieval peasant sleeping in 2 phases and eating a sugar-free diet wasn't healthier than us in every way. Not remotely. They died younger. They suffered from diseases we've conquered. They lived harder lives with far less comfort and security. But in these specific ways, in their sleep patterns and their dental health, they were doing something right. Not because they were wise, but because their circumstances forced them into patterns that happened to align with human biology. We have choices they didn't have. We can choose to stay up late with electric lights blazing. We can choose to eat candy for breakfast if we want. Those are real freedoms, real improvements in human autonomy. But with those choices comes responsibility. The responsibility to understand what we're choosing. The responsibility to recognize when our choices are hurting us. And the responsibility to adapt when we can. Maybe that means turning off screens an hour before bed and letting your body experience real darkness. Maybe that means accepting middle-of-the-night wakefulness instead of treating it as a disorder. Maybe that means reading by dim light or simply sitting with your thoughts during those quiet hours. Maybe that means questioning how much sugar you really need. Maybe that means choosing fruit instead of candy more often. Maybe that means recognizing that the sweetness in an apple, natural and subtle, is actually more satisfying than the cloying intensity of a modern dessert. These are revolutionary changes. They're tiny adjustments, small gestures toward a lifestyle that respects what our bodies actually need, rather than simply what our culture tells us to want. And here's what's beautiful about both of these stories. They give us permission to be different. Permission to sleep in ways that don't fit the standard advice. Permission to eat in ways that might seem old-fashioned or overly cautious. When someone tells you you're not sleeping right, you can remember Roger Eckert's research and the centuries of humans who slept in 2 phases. When someone offers you cake and you decline, you can remember the medieval peasants with their strong white teeth. You're not being difficult. You're not being strange. You're just recognizing that the modern way isn't the only way. And sometimes it's not even the best way. The past doesn't have all the answers. Medieval life was hard in ways we can barely imagine. Most of us wouldn't want to actually live as a medieval peasant, sleeping on straw and eating endless barley porridge. But the past does offer perspective. It shows us that the patterns we think are universal are often just recent inventions. It reminds us that humans are adaptable, that we've lived successfully in many different ways, and that what seems impossible to change might just be one choice among many. So tonight, if you wake at 2 a.m., remember the watch. Remember the peasants and artisans, the monks and mothers, all lying awake in the dark, thinking their thoughts, saying their prayers, simply being present in the quiet hours. And tomorrow, when you pass on that third cookie or decline the sugary coffee drink, remember those same peasants chewing their rough bread with strong white teeth, unaware that they were healthier than kings. The modern world offers us so much, but it also asks us to abandon patterns that served humanity well for millennia. We don't have to accept every trait. We can choose to honor the rhythms our bodies remember, even if our culture has forgotten them. We can be modern and still respectful of our biology. We can have electric lights and 8-hour workdays and still make room for darkness and natural sweetness. We're not medieval peasants. We're not meant to be, but we can learn from them. Not because they were perfect, but because they show us what's possible when humans live within the constraints that shaped our evolution. They slept when it was dark and woke when their bodies told them to. They ate what was available and kept their teeth. Maybe, just maybe, we can find our way back to some of that wisdom. Not by abandoning progress, but by being more thoughtful about which parts of it we embrace. The light bulb doesn't have to banish darkness. Sugar doesn't have to dominate every meal. We can have both, the old wisdom and the new comfort, if we're willing to be intentional about our choices. And that might be the real lesson of these two stories. Progress is inevitable, but how we respond to it, how we adapt, how we protect what matters while embracing what helps, that's up to us. The medieval world is gone, but the human body it shaped is still here. And if we listen carefully, it still remembers. If this journey through the forgotten rhythms of sleep and the unexpected wisdom of simple diets brought you some peace, some understanding, maybe even some relief from the anxieties of modern life, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if it genuinely helped. Only if you found something here worth keeping. And let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen to this. There's something beautiful in knowing that while we no longer share the watch or the simple meals, we still share the night and the search for better ways to live. Sleep well, in one phase or two, with teeth you've cared for by being thoughtful about what you eat. However, you choose to honor the body you've inherited from 10,000 years of human history. Good night.